The voicemail came in at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning, and my daughter-in-law's voice was so flat it barely registered as human. The mortgage payment bounced. Again. "We need you to cover it by Friday or we're going to have a real problem." Not hello, not dad, just we need you. I sat in my truck in the driveway for a long time after that, engine off, coffee going cold in the cup holder. The sun was just coming up over the neighbor's roof. I watched a robin land on the fence post and thought, I have been getting phone calls like that for 4 years. 4 years of "we need" and "can you cover" and "just this once," and not a single one of them starting with "hello." My name's not important. What matters is that I am 63 years old. I built a small plumbing supply business from nothing, sold it 11 years ago for enough to be comfortable, and I made the mistake that a lot of fathers make. I confused love with money. I thought that writing checks was the same thing as being present, and by the time I understood the difference, my son was 31 years old and had never balanced a checkbook in his life. Let me go back to where it actually started, because the voicemail was not the beginning. The beginning was a Sunday dinner about 2 years after my son married his wife, when he told me he had found the perfect house. My son is a good-looking kid. Takes after his mother, who passed when he was 19. After she died, I think I went soft in ways I did not recognize at the time. I gave him things because I could not give him her. I know that now. I did not know it then. He showed me photos of the house on his phone. 4 bedrooms, 3 baths, a finished basement, a 2-car garage on a cul-de-sac in a suburb about 40 minutes from me. It was a nice house. It was also listed at $490,000. My son worked in sales at a mid-sized company. Not a bad job, but not a $480,000 house job. His wife, whom I will call my daughter-in-law because that is what she was to me until she wasn't, had done some interior decorating work before they got married and had mostly stopped after. When I asked about their budget, my son scratched the back of his neck, the way he does when he knows I am not going to like what comes next. "We were thinking," he said, "that you could help with the down payment. Just the down payment." The down payment on a $490,000 house is not a small number. I asked how much they had saved. He looked at his wife. She looked at her phone. They had $4,200 saved between them. I should have said no. I know that. Every person reading this knows that. But I looked at my son, who has his mother's eyes, and I thought about all the dinners I had missed and all the school events I had been too busy for, and I wrote a check for $96,000. That was the down payment. What followed was a slow drip that I told myself each time was the last time. The mortgage was $2,900 a month. My son's take-home after taxes and his 401k contribution, which I had insisted on, was about $4,100. That left $20 for everything else. Food, utilities, car payment, insurance, the 2 dogs my daughter-in-law had brought into the marriage, her gym membership, his golf hobby that he had picked up somewhere along the way. It was not enough. It was not close to enough. And every month, like clockwork, one of them would call. I covered the difference most months. Some months it was $800. Some months it was $800. I stopped keeping a running total because the number made me feel sick. My accountant, a steady, no-nonsense woman who has managed my finances since the early days of the business, told me at my annual review that I had transferred just under $94,000 to my son and daughter-in-law in the previous 3 years alone. She did not say anything else. She just turned a page and moved on to the next item. She has known me long enough to say things with silence. I want to be clear about my daughter-in-law. She was not cruel to me. She was not even unkind exactly. She was just indifferent in a way that is almost worse than cruelty, because at least cruelty acknowledges that you exist. She would accept the transfers with a quick thanks text, no punctuation. She would answer my questions about how things were going with single words. She called me by my first name, which is fine, but she said it the way you say the name of a coworker you tolerate. Not warmth, just acknowledgement. My son was different. When it was just the 2 of us, he was still my boy. We could sit in the garage and talk about baseball, and he would laugh at the same dumb jokes he had always laughed at. But the moment she walked into the room, something shifted. He would get a little smaller, a little quieter. I used to think that was just how marriage worked. Now I think it was something else. I have one other child, a daughter who is 3 years younger than my son. She lives in Colorado, works as a physical therapist, owns her own condo, and has never once asked me for money. Not once. I say this not to create a comparison, but because it is relevant to what happened later. My daughter called me every Sunday. She remembered things I had told her weeks before and asked follow-up questions. She drove 14 hours to help me pack up my house when I downsized 3 years ago. She is a person who shows up, and I had not fully understood how rare that was until I started thinking clearly again. The phone call that changed everything came on a Thursday afternoon in early March. I had been trying to reach my son for about a week, nothing unusual, just some questions about the holidays, whether we were doing Easter dinner at my place or his. He is not a great texter, but he usually calls back within a day or two. That week, nothing. My daughter-in-law's phone went straight to voicemail. I left 2 messages. No response. I was not panicked, more puzzled than anything. I drove to their house on a Thursday afternoon because I was in the area and I thought I would just knock. The lights were on, both cars in the driveway. I rang the bell. My daughter-in-law answered. She was dressed up, which was unusual for a Thursday afternoon. Her hair was done. She had on a dress I hadn't seen before. Behind her, through the open door, I could hear voices. A lot of voices. I said, "Hey, just thought I'd stop by. Is everything all right? I've been trying to reach you guys." She looked at me and then looked back over her shoulder and then back at me. She said, "Oh, yeah, we've actually got people over right now. It's a party." I said, "Oh, okay, what's the occasion?" She paused for just a beat too long, and then she said, "It's a celebration. We got married in the Bahamas last weekend." I heard what she said. I understood every word, but for a moment my brain just refused to process it. I stood there on my own son's front porch and thought, that cannot be what she said. I said, "You got married?" She said, "We did a little ceremony. Just close friends, it was kind of a destination thing." I said, "But you were already married 4 years ago." She tilted her head just slightly. "We did a vow renewal. It was important to us." I nodded. I said, "Okay." I said, "Tell my son I stopped by," and I walked back to my truck. I drove about a mile before I pulled into a gas station parking lot and sat there. They had thrown a party in my son's house, a house I paid the down payment on, a party to celebrate a trip to the Bahamas, a trip that, as far as I knew, I had not been told about, let alone invited to. And my daughter-in-law had answered the door and looked at me like I was a delivery driver who had shown up at an inconvenient time. I called my daughter. She picked up on the second ring. I told her what had happened. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Dad, I need to tell you something. I talked to my brother about 2 months ago. He mentioned the trip. He said they were planning a big renewal ceremony with their friends. I asked if you were going," he said. She paused. "He said you probably wouldn't fit in with their crowd." I wouldn't fit in with their crowd. I am a 63-year-old man who built a business from a $12,000 loan and a used truck. I wear Wranglers, and I drive an F-150, and I do not own a Blazer that fits anymore because the last time I needed one was my son's actual wedding 4 years ago. I am not a sophisticated man. I know that, but I am the man who wrote the check that bought my son's house. I am the man whose money they were using to pay their mortgage while they saved for a trip to the Bahamas. I wouldn't fit in with their crowd. I sat in that gas station parking lot for 45 minutes. Then I drove home, made a pot of coffee, and called my accountant. I told her I needed to see a full accounting of every transfer I had made to my son's account in the last 4 years. She had it to me by end of business. $211,400. That was the number. Over 4 years, including the down payment, including all the monthly supplements, including the time his car needed a new transmission, and the time the furnace went out, and the time my daughter-in-law wanted new kitchen appliances, and my son asked if I could help out with that. $211,400. I also called my attorney that same evening. He is an old friend who handled the sale of my business and does not charge me to have a conversation. I asked him some questions. He answered them clearly. When I hung up, I knew what I was going to do. I did not call my son that night. I did not call my daughter-in-law. I went to bed early, and for the first time in a long time, I slept straight through. The next morning, I called my bank and put a stop on the automatic transfer that went into my son's account every month. It was set up as a recurring transfer, $1,400 every first of the month, listed in my online banking as household support. I had set it up so long ago that I sometimes forgot it was there. That morning I sat on the edge of my bed in my socks and canceled it in about 45 seconds on my phone. Then I waited. The first of the month came 17 days later. I knew they would notice. The question was, who would call first? It was my daughter-in-law. Of course it was. She called at 9 in the morning. I was on my back deck with my second cup of coffee, watching the birds at the feeder my wife had put up years ago that I still refill every week. I let it ring through. She called again 4 minutes later. I let that go too. Then she texted. The transfer didn't come through. Can you check on that? I looked at that message for a long time. Not hi, not hope you're well, not even a question really, just can you check on that, like I was a malfunctioning appliance that needed to be reset. I put my phone face down on the armrest and finished my coffee. She called again that afternoon. This time I picked up. She said, "Did you see my text? The transfer didn't come through." I said, "Yes, I saw your text." She waited. When I didn't continue, she said, "So can you send it? We need it for the mortgage." I said, "I'm not going to be sending that anymore." A beat of silence. Then, "What do you mean?" I said, "I mean I've decided to stop the financial support. It's been going on a long time, and I think it's time for you two to handle things on your own." Her voice changed. It got flatter and harder at the same time, if that makes sense. She said, "We have a mortgage payment due in 2 weeks." I said, "I know." She said, "You can't just stop with no warning." I said, "I gave you 4 years of support without conditions. I think that's been plenty of warning that this arrangement wasn't sustainable." There was a longer silence. Then she said, "I'm going to have my son call you." And I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing because she was so rattled. She said, "My son," when she meant her husband. My son called that evening. He sounded confused more than angry, which told me she had not told him the full picture. He said, "Dad, what's going on? She said you canceled the transfer." I said, "I did." He said, "Why?" I took a breath. I had thought about how I wanted to have this conversation. I did not want to yell. I did not want to lay out a list of grievances like I was reading charges in a courtroom. I just wanted to be honest. I said, "Son, I found out about the trip to the Bahamas after it already happened. I found out about the vow renewal when I knocked on your door and could hear 40 people celebrating inside your house. I didn't get a call. I didn't get a text. I found out on your doorstep." He was quiet. I said, "Your sister told me what you said, that I wouldn't fit in with your crowd." More quiet. Then, very low, "Dad, I said, "I'm not calling to fight. I'm not angry in the way you think I am. But I've been writing checks to help you build a life, and apparently the life you've been building doesn't have much room for me in it. So I think it's time I stopped subsidizing something I'm not part of." He said, "That's not fair." I said, "I love you. That hasn't changed, but I'm done." I hung up gently, not dramatically. Just done. What followed was unpleasant in the way that things are when people realize a resource has been cut off. My daughter-in-law sent me a long text the next day that covered the full range, from guilt to accusation to something that was close to a threat, though I couldn't tell you exactly what she thought she was threatening me with. My son called twice more that week. The first call I let go to voicemail. The second I answered, but he spent most of it explaining why their expenses were not their fault, which might have moved me more if I had not been listening to versions of that same explanation for 4 years. My attorney called to tell me there was nothing legally actionable in any of this. The money I had given was given. There was no written agreement, no loan documents. I knew that going in. I had never lent money to my son. I had given it. The distinction had felt loving at the time. Now it just felt like what it was. My daughter called me every day that week. She didn't say "I told you so" once, which is more grace than I deserved. She just listened, asked questions, and twice made me laugh at things that had no business being funny. The mortgage on my son's house went into default 2 months later. I know this because he called to tell me, and his voice when he called sounded different than it ever had. Younger somehow, like the 31-year-old veneer had come off, and underneath was just a confused kid who had gotten used to a safety net and never thought to learn what came after. He said, We might lose the house. I said, I know that's scary. He said, can you? I said, no. He didn't push, which surprised me. There was a long pause, and then he said, I'm sorry about the trip. I should have told you. I said, yes, you should have. Another pause. He said, she didn't want. And then he stopped himself. He said, I should have told you. I did not say, yes, you should have, again. I just said, I know. And I meant it in the way that means I know why it happened, and I know what it cost, and I know it can't be undone. And maybe that's the beginning of understanding it. They ended up selling the house, got enough out of it to pay off the mortgage and have a little left over. They moved into an apartment. My daughter-in-law's parents, who I had met exactly 3 times in 4 years, despite living 40 minutes in the other direction, helped them with the security deposit. I found that out through my son, and I won't pretend I didn't feel something sharp when I heard it. Mostly what I felt was they were capable of asking elsewhere all along. My son and I talk on the phone about once a week now. It is different than it was, more honest, I think, though the honesty is still tender in the way a bruise is tender, something you can press on carefully, but not hard. He got a second job doing weekend inventory work for a hardware chain. He mentioned it the same way you mention something small, but I heard something in his voice when he said it that I hadn't heard in a long time. Something that sounded like it might become pride, if he gives it enough time. His wife and I do not speak. That might change. I don't know. There is a version of the story where it does, where the crisis of losing the house becomes the pressure that reshapes things. I have seen that happen. I've also seen it not happen. I'm old enough to know that I don't get to write the ending to somebody else's story. What I do get to write is mine. I had dinner with my accountant last month. Not the kind where you go over numbers, but the kind where 2 people who have been through something sit across from a table at an ordinary restaurant and eat ordinary food and don't talk about the hard things, but feel them understood between them anyway. She asked me how I was doing. I told her I was lighter than I'd been in years. She nodded, like that was the right answer. I refilled the bird feeder this morning, the same one my wife put up. Took me a while to notice that I'd been doing it every week without thinking about it. Just muscle memory, just a thing I do because it needs to be done. There's something in that I've been turning over. You keep doing the quiet things. You keep showing up for the small obligations, the ones that don't ask anything dramatic of you. The ones that just require you to be steady and present and there. I did not do that for my son the way I should have. I gave him money when I should have given him time. I wrote checks when I should have said no and then showed up anyway. I know that. I have sat with that knowledge in the early mornings for most of this year, and I think I am finally done being ashamed of it and ready to just carry it forward as something I learned later than I should have. The robin is back on the fence post this morning. Same bird, maybe. Probably not. Doesn't matter. It lands, it looks around, it does what it came to do, and it goes. I pour the seed into the feeder and go back inside to make my coffee. There's a particular kind of quiet that comes after you stop doing something you should have stopped years ago. It doesn't feel like victory. It doesn't feel like loss either. It just feels like space. Like a room you've been filling with furniture for so long that you forgot there was a floor underneath. I think about the $400 sometimes. Not with bitterness the way I used to, but more the way you think about a lesson that cost more than it should have. Every one of those transfers made sense to me in the moment. Every single one. That's the thing nobody tells you about enabling someone you love. It never feels like a mistake while you're doing it. It feels like care. It feels like keeping something from falling apart. The mistake only reveals itself in the accumulation, in the slow arithmetic of years. What I understand now is that there are 3 things a person either builds or doesn't, and money can't substitute for any of them. The first is character, the basic honesty of knowing what you owe people, not in dollars but in presence, in acknowledgement, in the decency of a phone call before a party. My son is still working on that. I think he knows it. The second is judgment, the ability to look at your own situation clearly and make decisions that reflect reality rather than convenience. For a long time, my son's judgment was never tested because I kept removing the consequences that would have tested it. That was my failure as much as his. You cannot develop the muscle if it is never asked to carry weight. The third is the willingness to keep going when things get hard. Not recklessly, not out of pride, but the quiet, stubborn kind of forward motion that doesn't require an audience. My son getting that second job, mentioning it the way you mention something small, not asking for praise. That was the first real sign I'd seen in years. I made a man who was never asked to become one. That's a hard thing to carry. But I'm finding that carrying it honestly is lighter than I expected. The shame of it loses weight when you stop hiding it. My daughter called me last Sunday the way she always does. We talked for an hour about nothing important and everything that mattered. She has always known how to do that. I used to think I had two children and one of them needed more from me. Now I think I had two children and one of them was showing me, quietly, the whole time, what it looked like when you raised a person right. I just wasn't paying attention. The bird feeder is full. The coffee is on. The morning is ordinary in the way that ordinary mornings feel like gifts once you've earned them back. I don't know how my son's story ends. I hope it ends well. I hope losing the house becomes the pressure that reshapes him rather than the weight that breaks him. But I know now that is his work to do, not mine. My work was to stop doing his work for him. That took me longer than it should have. I'm doing it now. That's enough.